How's it going, everyone? Eulier Gonzalez again, exploring at the form handling with server actions, and specifically a concept that now is something that is not new to the internet, especially to the web servers. That is catch while revalidated, or in this case, stale while revalidated, which is part of the catch control extension for stale content. And I'm gonna put it here because this is what it's doing and is using behind the scenes this form handling with server actions. That's pretty interesting. And also why a lot of these particularly companies are, especially if you have worked with Next.js, they say, hey, do you know how can we now is prevent to send multiple unnecessary or how can we prevent firing up multiple HTTP requests? You know, what are the way of preventing to do that? So we have now this catching mechanism, particularly from the HTTP catch control extension for stale content, and I'm gonna put it here because this is very, very, very important to put it here. That makes a ton of sense. All right. Okay. So, in our code, right? Because we look at the subtle different, we saw the difference between the client and the server components and how actually it helps us to solve specific problems. I'm not gonna dive in too much, but just to make a quick recap of this is, by default, everything is a client-side component in React. So everything happens on the browser, and there's some challenges of that. One of them is the network duplication requests. The other is network waterfall, and there is no ability to catch that data once you fetch that. And you also have some race conditions. So now, with server components, we have all of these components that are around to do node stuff, server stuff, that are close to the data source, one, and that give us the ability to now catch React components on the server. Why is that? And why is this is something that we did before having server components? Well, with server components, because this content is now rendering on the server, aka it means that the client receive now is the static HTML, so it doesn't receive a client component that gonna takes over to provide interactivity. Everything that it needs is on the content. Everything that is pre-rendering on the server, now it is sent to the client. This is great for catching, right? And it makes a lot of sense. It makes a ton of sense. So, because with Next, the value proposition of this is, hey, we are going to give you now all the infrastructure, all the basic stuff that you need to put in place to write this web application using React, all right? Like the transform or transpiling from JSX to JavaScript, and the ESLint or the code form, the linting, the code linting, the code formatting, the static analysis with TypeScript, the unit testing for your functions, and also for your components using now testing library among other stuff, and give you the ability to now define is routes or in this case, different rendering modes, whether it's on the client or on the servers, and provide you is this functionality that you need to, as well as the styles or the CSS preprocessors or library that you want to go, especially when writing your UI elements. So this is great because now this helps us as a way to say, hey, Next.js provide all of this for us, and also is the deployment as well. So with Next, not only solve all of these infrastructure needs, but now Next 13, it's say, hey, also going to provide you is now the ability to organize your files or your route based on files, and the different rendering modes that you can go with. And so as we dive deep into these different rendering modes, and now to understand that everything forward is based on this foundation, React server components and React client components, and when we need to cover very specific stuff, especially on forms and also rendering list of elements. So how now with forms we have a specific way of creating that is going to help us to improve the different rendering modes. So in other words, improve is how we're gonna deploy, how we're gonna provide from the server is the content. Why is this? Because you might care is the SEO or the user experience, right? So if you want to close the gap between them, all right, you now can use this form validation and form handling. Now, because React Server Components is focused only on writing these React components on the server to do server stuff, and here's when you can define your asynchronous components to actually fetch some kind of data, and this is useful for run your server components once during a CI/CD process, or run your server components per request via a web server. So in other words, it is, or you run that in an statically site generators. So you build your app once in a CI/CD pipeline, and then you have all of that, or you now render these components on the server per request. So run each request using a web server. So this is the thing that you can do with server components. And well, that now server components are focused from Next.js perspective to be catched by default. So Next.js provide a lot of these things out of the box, so you can go with. So Next.js give it to you this optimizations out of the box. So everything here is catch. So when you define a server component, by default it is catch. So what happens is that when you want to do common stuff like sending a form that is usually won't change, or a list of elements, right? Because everything is catched by default, again, it's providing you all of these optimizations out of the box. Anytime that you want to now run a specific server-side logic, you want to indicate to Next, hey, it is time for us to re-render this content. with this piece of data. So that's interesting, and that's what we're going to explore here, because again, this is a very specific use case, for example, like forms, or for stuff that actually need to change based on a server logic, all right? That is server actions, and now they call this as so React. They don't call React now. They don't call it server action. They call this server functions, right? Server functions are for use in React server components. Until September 2024, we refer to all server functions as server actions. If a server function is passed to an action prop, which is this logic here, is passed to an action props or call from inside an action, then it is a server action. But not all server functions are server actions. But not all server functions are server actions. The naming in the documentation has been updated to reflect the server functions and can be used for multiple purposes. Server actions allow client components to call a async function executed on the server. It's like, hey, exactly. So server functions allow client components to call async functions executing on the server. Hey, this client component that I need to run, oh, okay. Again, this is understanding is the architecture of React. It's like, hey, this client component that need to run, that call async function executing, okay. So this client components that needs to call some sort of server code, executed, of course, on the server, we can call it. So, okay. Allow client components to call async functions executing on the server. So, how do I build support for server functions? When a server function is defined with the userver directive. Okay. Your framework, whatever framework that you're using, and that's why React recommend to go with or Next or Astro or Remix, but it's your framework will automatically create a reference to the server function and pass that reference to the client component. So, okay. So when that function is called on the client, React will send a request to the server to execute the functions and return the result. Server functions can be treated in server components and passed as props to client components. Or they can be imported, okay, and passed as props to client components. But they create a reference to the server function. Or they can be imported and used in client components. So this is when you need to run, when you want to your client components run or call async functions on the server. You might wonder, why do we need this? You know, why do I need this server function? What do we need this? This is the usage. Creating us again. Here we're going to explore this very specific stuff. So creating a server function from a server component. All right. So from a server component, this is it, right? So here you are creating your async function for that. You're going to return now that button and pass this reference. Okay. Pass this actions reference to that. So when React renders the empty node, exactly. So when React renders the empty node server function, it will create a reference to the create node actions and pass that reference to the button client here. when the button is clicked, React will send a request to the server to execute that server function, or to execute create node actions function with the reference provided. So which here, this is execute client, you define your button here, you receive now this server actions in your client components that allow you to now call server actions that allow you to call is logic on the server, and then give you now is the result from that. So as you do this on click, you're gonna now call on click, which is now the server action that was defined on the server, or the server functions, the server logic that was defined on the server, that you can do that for fetching data, for example, and on the client you pass that as a reference. Import, this is one use case, creating a server function from a server. The reason of this is to say, hey, okay, by the time that this component now is rendered here, importing server function from client components. Client components can import server function from files that use server. Importing server functions from client components. And then you say, hey, this is it, console log create node, this is from the actions. And then you say type of symbol.for react.server.reference followed by the ID create node actions. So this is now a reference, because the server, when you run your server function like this, it now creates a reference. Type of symbol for, it creates now a reference that points to that server logic, which is in this case this one. So when you call this, React behind the scenes, we're gonna fire up that request to call to that specific server logic, in this case fetching some data, and then you do that. Importing server function from client components. Server function with actions. Server functions can be called from actions on the client. Server function with actions. Oh, okay. Server functions with actions. Server functions can be called from actions on the client, which is, hey, you define this to update the name, right? This is the server action. And then you, on the client, you update, you import that as a reference here, and then on your form, on submit actions, you're gonna now pass that reference to this. So this is now an async function here that it say, hey, you start a transition. Look at this. We are actually is using now some of these hooks. Use transition and start transition. Is pending and start transition. Use transition, and then you say, hey, start transition here, and this is what you're gonna do when you do that. Set the error and set the name. So we got now this where you're going to update the name, and if there any error, all right, set the error. If not, set the name. Again, this is for solving Facebook specific problems. This allows you to access the is pending state of the server function by wrapping it in an action on the client. For more, see the docs calling server function outside of form. But this is now calling the server actions, okay, in a client component. So calling this reference that the framework provide to you and pass that to the client for that. Jesus. Server function with form actions. Server functions work with new form features in React 19. You can pass the server functions to a form to automatically submit the form on the server. To automatically submit the form on the server. So you can pass a server functions to a form to automatically submit the form to the server. This is server function with actions and server function with form actions. When the form submission succeeds, React will automatically reset the form and you can add use action state to access the pending state. You can add use action state to access the pending state, last response, or support progressive enhancement. For more, see the server functions in form. Okay. Server functions in form. And the other is server function with use action state. So on the client, you can call server function with use action hook for the common case when you need access to the action pending state and last return response. So it's like, hey, I want to now add in some sort of I want to provide some sort of feedback to the client here in state. So you can state.error, span fail state error, or this. So when using use action state with server functions, React will also automatically replay form submissions entered before hydration finish. React will automatically replay form submission entered before hydration finish. This means the user can interact with your app even before the app has been hydrated. For more, see docs for use action servers, action state, and progressive enhancement with use action state. Server function also support progressive enhancement with a third argument of use action state. Progressive enhancement. Update name, null, and name update. When the permalink is provided to the user actions, React will redirect. Yes. React will redirect to the provide URL if the form is submitted before the JavaScript bundle loads. Okay, React will redirect to the provide URL if the form is submitted before the JavaScript bundle loads. Jesus, it's because there's very specific use cases to handle here with use client, building with interactivity and state, using client APIs, or using third-party APIs. So create context, React and React DOM, forward ref, Memo, start transition. If they use client API, is that. Interesting. serializable type returned by server components. Broad value passed from a server component to a client must be serializable. Primitive, iterables, date, plain object, those created with object initializer with serializable properties. Functions that are server functions, which is a reference for this. Client or server components element GSX promises. Notably, these are not supported. Functions that are not exported from client mark model or MapReduce server. Classes. Objects that are instance of any classes other than the built-in mentions or object with null properties. Symbol not registered globally here. A building with interactivity and state. Using with client APIs. Exactly, we're using with third-party services. Then the use server is say, hey, server functions in form, which is very specific to this. That makes a lot of sense. It's very specific to this. Server functions in form. The most common use case of server function will be calling functions that mutate data. On the browser, the HTML4 elements is a traditional approach for a user to submit a mutation. But anytime you need to make a mutation, especially with forms, you go with this. With React's server components, React introduces first-class support for server actions as actions in form. It is a form that allows a user to request a username. In this example, request username is a server function passed to a form. When a user submits this form, there is a network request to the server function request username. When calling a server function in a form, React will supply the form's form data as the first arguments to the server function. React will supply the forms exactly when calling on the server, and it's a server function. Request username is a server function passed to a form. It's a server function passed to a form. When a user submits this form, there is a network request to the server function request username, and when calling a server function in a form, React will supply the form's data as the first argument to the server function. By passing a server function to the form actions, React can progressively enhance the form. React can progressively enhance the form. This means that forms can be submitted before the JavaScript bundle is loaded. React can progressively enhance the form. Progressive enhancement. Is a design philosophy that provides a baseline of essential content and functionality to as many users as possible. Okay, while delivering the best possible experience only to users on the most modern. Exactly, while delivering the best possible experience only to users of the most broader browsers that can run all the required code. The word progressive is progressive enhancement means creating a design that achieves a simpler but still usable experience for users of all the browsers and devices with limited capabilities, while at the same time being a design that progresses the user experience up to a more compelling, fully featured and all that kind of thing. Okay, but in other words, it's a philosophy to say, hey, we want to provide the content and functionality to as many users as possible, but delivering is the best possible experience only to those users with the most browser, with the most modern browsers. By passing a server actions to the form actions, React can progressively enhance the form. So you're gonna provide some of this functionality, or providing is the best user experience for those with the modern browsers. This means that the form can be submitted before the JavaScript bundle is loaded. Handling return values in form. It's because now it changed this architecture, or it's a way to now rethink your architecture here with server components and by looking now at the request and response model. Damn some. Calling a server function. Use action state if you're gonna get now state and actions. This is the action and this is the state. Request username. Request username. It returns success or fail. Can request username. Okay. Know that like most hooks, use action state can only be called in client code. Calling a server function outside of the form. Server functions are exposed server endpoints and can be called anywhere in the client code. When using server functions outside of a form, call the server function in a transition, which allows you to display a loading indicator, show optimistic state updates, use optimistic, show optimistic state updates, and handle unexpected error. Form will automatically wrap server function in transitions. So if you want to call a server function outside of a form, you need to wrap them into a start transition, or in this case into a use transition. When using a server function outside of a form, call the server function in a transition. Okay. Call the server function inside of the transition, which allows you to display a loading indicator, show optimistic state updates, and handle unexpected errors here. Holy moly, bro. So this is now what you want to now increment that. For example, you have increment like, all right? And this use transition is going to handle this, that behind the scenes. And on the server, you say, hey, like counted, and return the like counted here. To read a server function return value, you will need to await the promise return. Set like count locally with the current count value that you get it from here. Again, very narrow specific, this kind of stuff. All right. Oh, this is the rabbit hole. And this is pretty cool because now, at least with this server functions and using now with forms, we are reusing some of the standards of the web, which is pretty cool. I really love that. We're not reinventing the wheel or inventing something out of the box. So let's get into this. All right. So in our case, right, if we define our actions here,
if I had a question mark, because we wrote the schema, so we can just look right
okay,
for content somewhere on here.
if we define our actions here, we need to return that
You can open up
to
HTTP
view.
request, hit the, you need a response back. So
You need a response back. Next.js 14 will allow server actions response. Next.js 14 and server actions response. Okay. Because version 13, you're currently viewing server actions and mutations. At least back then. At least back then. Holy moly, bro. All right, server response. Okay. All right. Okay, Jesus. Let's get into this, my friend. Okay, there is quite a lot here going on.
that's why server actions are really good for side effects. If you don't know what a side effect is basically some, like, if I'm a user, like like for instance, if you've ever done analytics, you've ever rigged analytics for an app, every time you'd call track, that's a side effect. The app doesn't depend on you calling analytics. It's
Server components.
probably like for instance, if you've ever done analytics, or a big blocker right there. That's a big no. You kind of need that if you are performing some action. You need a response back. So that's why server actions are really good for side effects.
So server actions. For side effects.
And they're waiting, showing a loading screen until you finish this track. Right? It's just happening on the side. It's a side effect. So server actions are great for side effects, things that have to happen on the server, in which the UI or the user doesn't need to wait for. Maybe you have some asynchronous event-driven architecture that's handled by webhooks, so you can just fire this, that fires a webhook, and something responds to it later. Who knows? But it's great for side effects. If you need to change, or what Next.js would say, mutate your backend. Mutating your backend basically just means not only did you change something on your database or whatever source of truth you have, but you need the response from it. If you need to do that, you can still use server actions, and that's what we're going to do. But I think right now, I would probably still just do all that on the client for now. I think if you need to change the UI based off something that happened on the back end, you should probably just make an API call on the front end. in my opinion. The same way you've ever used React. Just do a use effects or whatever, or on click call this function that does a fetch. Probably just make an API call in the front end, in my opinion. The same way you've ever used React. Just do a use effects or whatever, or on click call this function that does a fetch. I would probably still do that right now, although, as you'll see, we'll be able to do this. So we have it to do. We created it. Do that.
Wait a single moment.
Who knows? But it's great for side effects. If you need to change, or what Next.js would say, mutate your backend. Mutating your backend basically just means not only did you change something on your database or whatever source of truth you have, but you need the response from it. If you need to do that, you can still use server actions, and that's what we're going to do. But I think right now, I would probably still just do all that on the client for now. I think if you need to change the UI based off something that happened on the back end, you should probably just make an API call on the front end, in my opinion. The same way you've ever used React. Just do a use effects or whatever, or on click call this function that does a fetch. I would probably still do that right now, although, as you'll see.
How old is this? Like a year ago? Okay. Oh, like a year ago? I get it. Like a year
Although,
ago?
as you'll see, we'll be able to do this. So we have it to do. We it. Let's see what happens before we try to get it back. So let's bring it into our new form to do.
So okay. So these server actions are good for side effects, and let's go to the code, man. Let's go to the code. There you got it, right? So this server actions will help us to solve a specific problem here by creating now here an action folder here. Say action.ts. That here is when you do this server function, server logic here. Hey, this server logic that we're gonna do is, in our case, is calling the database, especially calling using Prisma. We use Prisma as the ORM, object relational mapping. This is an SDK for database, right? So it guarantees the same user experience, developer experience across different, at least right now, relational database, SQL and Postgres and SQLite, and the document base like MongoDB. So because we don't want to actually set up a server for ourselves with a database like MySQL and Postgres or MongoDB, we go with SQLite, which is great because now this is a file-based database, or this file-based is an SQL file base. That makes a lot of sense. So exactly. So basically, it's SQL based on a file. So we don't have to host our own database. That's why we go with SQLite. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. Absolutely. All right. Then we are here. Okay. So what we're gonna do is defining these server actions like a normal function. In this case, it's like, hey, async function here. I'm not gonna get anything right now. Let me call this name conventions. Here we go. New to do. All right. Say new to do. Cool. And here I want to do is this. Hey, I want to now the DB, which is something that I want to import that from utils. That's right. This is now our wrapper around the Prisma client, in this case to the connections and system. Again, something that we're going to explore that later, but not right now. But what we care is to import that, right? It say, hey, I cannot find that. Util, well, that's quite silly. So please just get that here, TV, that's right. Right, and then once we import that, we can have access to, in this case, our model, which is the to-do. That's one of the things that Prisma actually help you with that, since this is a type safe ORM. So you now define all of your models, whether it's on a schema or a document base, but you define that in this particular model, like this. All right, we just only define this. And well, by the time you want to query that data, you actually now have this nice auto-completion feature that TypeScript provide to us. And what are the different operations on this data? So in this case, find many, because we're gonna get all of this, right? And since we have to wait for this data to be done, all right, in our case, this is now reading this local file. If you can imagine that you need to use Postgres or MySQL, that is now using is the disk, similar to SQLite, it is using disk. You of course need to wait for that to get that value. So let's go into wait for that, right? And once that is done, I want you to assign that to the to-dos identifier like so, right? Because now here we say, hey, oh, here we go. Option. Ooh, okay. Here's another one. I prefer this one. I prefer this one. I prefer this one. Alt escape. Okay, alt escape. And it's gonna give you is what do you want to do, right? In this case, because I don't want to find, in fact, I want is create. Say, hey, create, right? Of course, it's complain and say, hey, wait, what? No. This is complaining, right? And say, hey, if you read about this, you say, hey, you should give me something to that. Data is declared here, right? It's telling you, hey, this parameter, blah, blah, ball, blah, select all of this, the TL of this is say, hey, data is declared here. So you need to put is data. And since our data, it expects to at least some of those properties are required. So if you read carefully here, it says the spec type come from property data, blah, 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 blah. But the data needs to create a to-do. Select the null and undefined data with all of this. An empty object is not assignable to this, right? That's right, because it now is, you must provide is the content as it is, right? It actually doesn't tell you nothing to that. So we are going to get this content from that, and that'll be all. So here we create our first now server actions. Okay, so if we want to make use of those service actions, it must be on the page, or in this case is on the component that we want to import that and then pass. So import that and then pass that actions to the form actions that is going to handle that is the progressive enhancement. React will going to take care of that progressive enhancement.
And then on the form, I'm going to say action like this, and I'm going to say new to do like so. The last thing I need to do is add a button here that says new to do, and give it a type submit. That.
Yeah, but I need
so
to
because we added this to the
that.
form now, which means the form is going to pass in whatever argument goes to this function, whereas before when we wrote it,
exactly, but we need to export that. You say, hey, export xing function here for that, right? And then here, now that is saved, you say, hey, new to do, and new to do. No, it doesn't. Even though we're exporting as this, it's not autocomplete. It's new to do. Anyway, say new to do for real. All right, that's quite a lame. All right, and this is it. We save this, right? And then I want to import is that new to do. All right, as okay, as a constant, as a function. Interesting. And
we assume we're going to get content. Well, now that it's on the form, we're actually not going to get content. We're going to get like something called like form data.
Exactly. So what it's doing behind the scene is that now for form validations, you're going to get is a form data object. Where now this form data object is when you say, hey, form data dot get and the name. Or in this case, exactly, name.
We're going to get form data. So form data is just like an object that you can use to get data from a form from. So in this case, we'll say form data.get, and then the name of the input in which we want to get the value from. So I haven't given this input a name. Let's give it one. So I'll say the name of this input is content.
Okay, this is content, and the name is content, right?
You can call it whatever you want. You can call it
so
to do.
in label we
so
say is now content.
And then now in my actions, I can say form data.get content, the name of that input.
Yep. well, in our case, yeah, we can say content, we say name and all that kind of stuff. But in our actions, we're gonna get is now the content for this. You say, hey, this must be is a form data for that, right? Which is a form data. And then you say, hey, I expect now the content to be a string. So if there is anything there, this is now when the validation comes in. You're gonna say, hey, I want you to now pass the content, right, or any empty value there. So if the content is different to null, right? So we're gonna get this form data entry value null is not assignable to type string, type null is not assignable to type string. So what you can do here is to say, hey, in our case, right, we wanted to verify that the data that we get here is actually correct. Part of this validation, you say, hey, form data from this API is this is the content, right? Content, content, and assign that to a variable here, and then you say, hey, if you get anything in the content, all right, that's good. Or you can do is the nullish coalitions, like so. So once you pass that content to this, it's supposed not to complain that. You say, hey, form data is not assignable to type string. The type file is not assignable to type string. Expected type count from property content, which is declared here on type here. Form data. So it's like, hey, yeah, I'm pretty sure that form data, it will be now in a string, okay? So you can say, hey, this will be now a string, okay? TypeScript, this will be now an string, as a string, all right? And you can be quite safe with that as a string. All right, it's like telling to TypeScript, hey, no, I know what it is. This will be a string for that. You know, this might be one of them. This is type assertion, or you say, hey, check the content here. Okay, that this must be an string. Or like that, right? It say, hey, this will be form data entry value. For data entry value. To a string, and then you're now done, right? So transform that into a string. If this is null, well, this will be empty, which is great thing of the nullish coalitions. So there you got it. So now TypeScript is not complaining about this. This is how we can make sure of this kind of validation. Of course, it's going to complain about it because now it says, hey, I'm not running this, or I do, I am. Oh, okay, yeah. So if we navigate to the to-dos, all right, it doesn't show anything, but it shows a couple errors beyond the line. You say, hey, functions cannot be passed directly to client components unless you explicitly expose it by marking it with use server. So it means that on our server components here, like so, right, especially on our to-do form, we need to tell, hey, these actions is on the server.
Next.com. So we gotta turn that on. Once we have
Experimental server actions, I think this is something that we already did. Oh, we don't even have a button here. Let me actually add a button here to do this of type submit, right? And you say new to dos. So once we navigate to this, it of course now is broken. It says for actions functions cannot be passed directly to client components unless you explicitly expose it by marking it with use server, at least in this version, right? So we will need to tell or to say, hey, this is a directive you're telling to. That's because this is, even though in the error is telling you functions cannot be passed directly to client components unless you explicitly expose it by marking it with use server. In this case, if I mark this function as server, now I'm telling to the framework, hey, this is now a server function and now everything works. So you can do this. Hey, that's great. But hey, we don't actually add in anything. But if we refresh, it say, hey, object is not a valid object, blah, 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 blah. Objects are not valid as React child. Wow, we throw an errors on development. And the counting must be on a stream, right? Here we receive an error say objects are not valid as React child, found object with keys. If you meant to render a collection of children, use an array instead. It's gonna make this as any for that, you know. Put this at any. I'm not a big fan of this, right? If we re-render this component again, ooh, we broke that shit. We broke that shit. Objects are not valid as React child, found object with keys. We broke that. Okay. npm Prisma Studio. Okay, those are added correctly, right? We add them correctly to that, but we weren't able to show anything. We can delete all of the records. But if we want to now run our def, especially in our forms, and we run the to-dos, right? And here we say, hey, is new one, and actually not showing anything. But if I re-render this, of course, it actually break and go into and shatter into pieces. All right.
We want that just to pop up immediately.
But in my case, it doesn't do that.
Get rid of the state, get rid of all this, and we're gonna make a form that submits on the server side. So I just need to figure out where I want to put it. Put the new to-do form. You could also put it inside of the to-do page. That's also fine. Submit a form.
It's because the way how we are now calling that. Oh no, and it's because we are rendering is now an object there. We render is to do. Exactly. We're trying to render is now. This is the content here. We're trying to render now is an object. That's what happened. This is the heuristic that I'm doing here. Okay, so now we render is this new one, but when we say hey new another, and we click here, it's like hey we didn't actually add something, but when we refresh, we have this similar to this. But how can we now is in our case how in our case can solve this, bro? How in our case can solve this, right? Especially that we don't need to refresh that and then well somehow do so we don't have to wait for this page to be loaded, right?
Like tell it to go fetch its data. So that's what we want to do after our server action. So let's do that. So we can go into our action, and right after we do this, we can just say, yeah, just do a revalidate, right quick, revalidate path / to-dos. And you can think of this as like a soft refresh. It's not going to refresh the page.
And then you do is what this pretty F things works or sings to me, right? Which is, hey, by the time that you run this code on the server, in this case, create something to do, I want you to now revalidate this path. What in other words is that do a soft refresh. So revalidate path from the catch, because everything here is catch by default. And if something change here, I want you to is now revalidate, stale while revalidate. where you say, hey, this will be now the to-dos. So if we go back to our application here, let's say this one, right? If we refresh this, we're gonna see all of this that we had been already added, right? And then, hey, I would like to now add is a new one, right? And I hit enter, and then look at what happened here. So the document has been loaded, all right? What I would like to actually do that from the scratch. Okay, let me run the database here pretty quickly with PNX Prisma Studio. Okay, and then remove all of this for that. Great, that's cool. No more data, no more data in on the database. Run the dev server. Okay, refresh. And we got all of this. So let me remove the to-do page here, like so. Much better, right? So let me add new to-do. You say, hey, a new one. When you hit enter, look at what it's doing. It's like now React behind the scenes is when you do when you submit a form. So since you create these actions or server logic under the function, since you create these functions on the server using the useServer tag to indicate the framework, in our case Next.js, hey, I would like to create a reference to this function on the server, and when you pass that to a client components in a form, you're going to now handle this progressive enhancements, firing up a request like this is firing up a request. So the framework is firing up a request, okay, as you can see, and this is the shape of this request. So the framework is firing up this request. Content disposition form data is firing up this request, okay, and sending now the proper data for that, okay. So the response of this request, it'll be now this set of files and stuff like that, which is our pre-rendered data. Followed by the style that we need to, and the themes. But the request here is now this kind of data. Is all of this information that now React needs to actually re-render that on the app client to re-render this with the proper data. Let me see if we can find here that. Can we find here is the new a new one, right? It's like new one, and then you got it, right? With this new value here. So if I say, hey, new to do, and I hit enter. So if I take a look at this and say, hey, new to do, not there, new to do is this data. So you have now the new one and the new. So it is interesting because now this is to help us solve this form validation with JavaScript, without JavaScript. And that is pretty sick, bro. And this revalidation path is because
but it's going to expire the cache of that action, revalidate this page, which will then like tell it to go fetch its data. So that's what we want to do after our server action. So let's do that. So we can go into our action, and right after we do this, we can just say, yeah, just do a revalidate right quick, revalidate path / to-dos. You could think of this as like a soft refresh. It's not going to refresh the page, but it's going to expire the cache of that page, which then forces it to go refetch its data. So let's do that. So now
revalidate
expire the cache / to-dos. You could think of this as like a soft refresh.
You can think of revalidate as a soft refresh. Holy moly.
It's not going to refresh the page, but it's going to expire the cache of that page, which then forces
Exactly. You can think of revalidate as a soft refresh.
it to go refresh. You could think of this as like a soft refresh. It's not going to refresh the page, but it's going to expire the cache of that page, which then forces it to go refetch its data.
So it is, in reality, it is expire the cache of that page, therefore forces the page to update the cache.
You could think of this as like a soft refresh. It's not going to refresh the page, but it's going to expire the cache of that page, which then forces it to go refetch its data.
Which is forces, exactly. In reality, this is part of the cache of that space, therefore forces the refetch, forcing refetch the data on that page. So hey, this already expired, so then I'm going to now render these components or fetch that data on that page.
So let's do that. So now when I add a new to-do, clean my room, it just shows up on the page without me refreshing. And that's because we did a server action on the server that changed something in the database. We waited for that to happen, and then we
And
that's because we did a server action on the server.
The example in the code illustrate you make a server code, exactly. You make a server code, you make a server action in your code. You make a server action. Okay, you make a server action with use server, or you make a server action or server function. You make a server action with use server that fetch data, pre-render that.
That changed something in the database. We waited.
Or in this case, that exactly. That in this case, that changed something in the database. wait for that data to be loaded.
For that to happen, and then we told Next.js.
Or wait for that to happen. Exactly, especially here. So we make a server action with user server that changes something in the database. In our case, creates a to-do, wait for it to happen, and then tell React, and then tell Next.js redirect.
Delete the cache.
And then tell Next.js delete the cache. Delete the cache for this page.
Which then made it go.
Deletes the cache for this page slash to-dos, which makes then
fetch its own data all over again, which then got an array of 2 to-dos and put them on the page.
Then tell Next.js delete the cache for this page, fetch the data from that.
Delete the cache for this page slash to-dos, which then made it go fetch its own data all over again.
So, which makes that page fetch all the data all over again, and
which then got an array of 2 to-dos and put them on the page.
Which is on the to-do list, which is on the to-do list, and put it on the page.
The crazy thing about this is that this would work even with JavaScript off, because there is no JavaScript on the front end that's making this happen. It would work completely without JavaScript. And that's the benefit of server actions, that you can have interactive apps without JavaScript, but you can also do this without writing JavaScript. You can do this with pure HTML too. So it's kind of cool to see Next.js come around to this and building this functionality. But we've had this functionality before frameworks existed, but not in a structured way. So I guess this is kind of like the best of both worlds, having that structure, but also kind of getting back to the standards of the web, form actions, response objects, things like that, which I think is kind of cool. Okay, so yeah, any questions on that? On how that happened? Like when I first saw it, I thought it was just pretty magical, but then I realized like, it's just like web standard stuff, but it is still pretty cool to be able to use React purely as a templating engine and not have to rely on it for like heavy clients. I was like, it's just like web standard stuff, but it is still.
It is interesting. At least this is interesting to me. This is interesting because it is based on web standards. That is based on rendering, template rendering.
Cool to be able to use React purely as a templating engine and not have to rely on it for like heavy client-side stuff, unless you opt into it. So it's kind of pretty cool to be able to use React purely as a templating engine.
So it is, so you can use React as a template engine
and not have to rely on it for like heavy client side.
And not having to rely on heavy client side apps. Very, very important here.
Stuff, unless you opt into it. So it's kind of cool.
Unless you opt into. This for handling server, right, is now, you can use now React as a server, as a template engine, and not having to rely on client side apps unless you opt into. Remember, React was developed to build user interface, of course, on the client side. Now they have evolved to be more like a template engine.
Yeah, but any questions on that?
We have this structure
So yeah, we
way
just keep
to
adding
this.
stuff right here, right? We can be like, hello, yellow, whatever. And then if we refresh this, they should still be there because we're pulling that down. Loading an error. So loading an error is actually pretty cool. So what if, so I know a while ago, have you ever heard of, like, anyone ever heard of React Suspense? All right, never heard of React Suspense. So React Suspense basically allows you.
Jesus. That'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.